And hello, my fabulous students. This is your favorite teacher, Mr. Jacobson. I'm excited to be with you today. Today, we are talking about interactions with American Indians, slavery, and the colonists. This is APUSH. We are in Unit 2, so let us begin. All right. So we start seeing some conflict happening in New England. Okay, so relationships between the colonists and the Native Americans, they would get heated from time to time. The New England colonists in Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, New Haven, eventually they're going to form some kind of a military alliance known as the New England Confederation in 1964. So this is going to be a way in which they can protect each other, right? You have each colony is going to get two representatives. There's going to be some powers, albeit limited, in settling some boundary disputes, runaway slaves happening, dealings with the Native Americans. And so you kind of have this confederacy being born and this idea of having representation within that confederacy. Anyway, it's not going to last super long, but around 40 years ish, close to at least. Uh, yeah, pretty close. Actually, it is 40, 41. So the Confederation ended in 1648 or 84 when colonial rivalries and renewed control by the English monarchs brought this first experiment in colonial cooperation to an end. However, before it came to an end, there was a very successful war that the Confederacy helped win, which was known as Metacom's War or King Philip's War. So, as more settlers encroached on American Indians' land, a chief by the name of Metacom Wampanoag, if you want to call it that, but Metacom is fine. Known to the colonists as King Philip, united his tribes in New England against the colonists. Now, some American Indian tribes, um, well, they had rivalries with Metacom already, so then they sided with the colonists. So, like the Mohegans, the Pequot, um, they're going to they don't like them, and this is a common thing we see. I mean, it's the same reason why we have natives who sided with Cortez when he conquered the Aztecs, Montezuma in particular, the leader, because they didn't like him. They thought he was a bunch of freaking jerks. So you know they wanted him out, and so they helped the Spanish. And in this case now we have the Mohicans and we have the Pequot. They're also trying to get rid of a guy they feel is worse than, I guess, the colonists themselves. So you're gonna have this Metacom war. Several villages are gonna get burned. Hundreds of people are gonna get killed. Thousands of people injured. Um, but in the end, Metacom will be killed and the war will end. And again, it'll just be one of those instances that show that there's Indian resistance to the colonists continually spreading upon the 13 colonies and the frontier in that region. We also have conflict in Virginia happening. So you have Sir William Berkeley, he's the royal governor, and he's coming over and he's kind of favoring all the large plantation owners because they're the wealthy. The small farmers are kind of feel like they're getting the short end of the stick. They're not being protected properly. There's a lot of Native American Indian attacks happening in the outskirts, and they're like, "Hey, you got to have our back. You're our governor. Why aren't we being protected here?" And so eventually, this is going to erupt into a man by the name of Nathaniel Bacon, and it's that's it. He's going to start an insurrection. It's called Bacon's Rebellion, and you have you have massacres happening. You have the British Crown being fought against. Eventually, they're going to burn the settlement of Jamestown to show their discontent, if you will. However, he's going to die of dysentery, And what that means is once Bacon died, you kind of have the whole resistance that kind of falls apart at that point, and then the crown will execute about 23 rebels. But what do we learn from all this? So we learn a few things. One, there are sharp distinctions happening in the colonies, which are becoming more and more apparent, and people are showing their discontent for it. We also see that there's conflict happening on the frontier skirts, right, of the American the 13 colonies. And we're also starting to see that people are kind of resisting the crown. They don't like it. They came to America for more autonomy, and now they're just getting more of the same that was received in England. So people are starting to resist that as well. So, but especially this resistance of the royal crown, all these problems are going to start compounding further. They're not going away. Each one of these problems are going to get more and more exacerbated to the point where it will eventually lead to revolution and even a war, right? So we have the Pueblo Revolt happening. So this is in Arizona, New Mexico region, and you have a bunch of Spanish who are Roman Catholic, and they bring a bunch of missionaries over, and these missionaries are told you need to convert these people, and they have encomienda systems, and the encomienda systems are teaching them the language of Spanish, they're teaching them Roman Catholicism. However, they're being very aggressive and almost uncompromising, if you will, right? And so we have various tribes who are kind of done with it, you know. So you got the Hopi, you got the Sunni. Um, they're ready to go, and so this ignites into a Pueblo revolt. They are going to chase out the Spanish. They are going to kill many. However, by 1692, so that's what 12 years after the revolt began, the Spanish will regain the land. However, the Spanish will be less aggressive, which is, you know, kind of important thing to understand that the Spanish realize that okay, we went too far. There's only these people have a limit, right? You can't just push them and push them and push them and push them, and they're just going to take it. So then they became a little bit more understanding, so there could be more stability in the region. Indentured servants become a really big thing, especially in Virginia and Maryland at this time. With all the disease happening, you got natives who are dying, and so they got to find another source of labor, right? And so they reach out to people in England, and these wealthy landowners would pay passage for people from the British Isles to come on over to across the Atlantic and to work on plantations. Now the contract was usually between 4 to 7 years, and during that time they would basically be a servant or a slave. They wouldn't really have a whole lot of rights. They were expected to work hard. Many of them felt overworked and even abused during this time. However, after the 4 to 7 years, then these individuals could go out. They could work for themselves. They might even have a skill by that time. They could earn wages, and if they wanted to, they could even become landowners, etc. So, um, this this was a system whereby the tobacco planters, the large plantation owners, right, could get a labor force, but the labor force knew that there was something in it once they were done with their contract, that they weren't a full slave for life, if you will, that there will be an end, and in that end, they will be in America where there's much more opportunity. This also started something called the headright system. So Virginia tried to attract immigrants by offering 50 acres of land to each immigrant who paid to cross the ocean, or 50 acres to the landowners that paid for a worker to cross the Atlantic Ocean. So a lot of landowners were willing to pay that because they could get acreage, right? But anyway, this is a system that worked for a little bit, but eventually, you know, with the more plantations coming up and up and up, there's a higher demand going on for labor, and things are changing. So slavery in Virginia starts to happen. Um, Again, you got indentured servants. They're not in lifelong bondage. Their children will be born free, and so they lose their labor after a time, right? So, however, in the 1660s, the House of Burgesses, which is in Virginia, right? So this is like the representative lawmakers in that region. They enacted laws that kept African and their offspring in permanent bondage. So now we have laws where there is Africans. I mean, there were Africans that were indentured servants at one point, but now they're changing those laws, and it's going to eventually filter throughout most of the 13 colonies, right? If not all of them. So New England is going to have the least amount of slaves, okay? Just because New England is just more made up of small farmers. There's not massive plantations, so to speak. The middle colonies, however, they'll get a fair amount of African slaves. Those African slaves will be largely used in the harbor region to load and unload. And then the southern colonies, they're going to have a huge amount of plantations, which means they have a massive demand for labor, and then slave labor becomes that that criteria that meets that demand. Because now um, you have people that are completely in bondage, and so they can't get out of it. Therefore, the plantation owners don't have to keep looking for new labor yearly or bi-yearly or so on, right? Um, so by 1750, half of Virginia's population and two-thirds of South Carolina's population were enslaved. Were slaves. So here's some factors to keep in mind, factors, reasons as to why we have an increase of slavery. So one, the wages in Europe start to reduce the supply of immigrants to the colonies. So there's wages that go up in Europe, and so less people are looking for indentured servitude. Okay. Two, they're looking for a dependable workforce. So these large owners, they need something they can rely on. They have major problems like small farmers are causing trouble. They got indentured servants that are going to be out in 4 to 7 years. And then you also have Atkins Rebellion that also makes things just harder. And so they need something more stable, something they can rely on, something that they can have total control over. So low cost labor also becomes an issue as tobacco prices fell due to. Do you guys remember we talked about um, where the due to mercantilist practices, England told the Americas, look, you can only sell your tobacco to us, and that's it. You couldn't sell it to anybody else. And so they would sell it to them, but then the people in Britain knew that they could only sell it to them, so then they would offer lower prices for what they're worth. And then the people of Virginia are like, well, that's not cool. And so then they started raising their prices. But then the people in Britain started raising their goods that they sold to the America. It was a problem, right? And so as as the cost starts becoming less and less worth it, you have other people looking to say, okay, maybe tobacco's not the thing because of this mercantilist practice of I have to sell to this person. So then they jump ship to like rice and indigo because they just became more profitable because there wasn't as many regulations and stipulations on those two cash crops, and so people are jumping over there. With that, it required more land to use that as a cash crop. With more land, more you have more space, and you also have more track that needs to be cultivated, and it just required more labor, and not necessarily skilled labor. It could be unskilled labor. I mean, you could teach someone to put a seed in the ground or whatever, and how to harvest and stuff. So it wasn't super um, complex. So we have slavery laws and resistance that occur. So some of the slavery laws that happen here, um, remember that the laws will ensure that slave status will be inherited. So in 1641, Massachusetts became the first to recognize the lawful enslavement of captives. In 1661, Virginia passed a law that children inherited their mother's slave status for life. In 1664, English law that baptized Christians could not be enslaved was overturned. So they had this thing where saying, look, if you're a Christian and you're an African slave or whatever, or I'm sorry, an African laborer, you couldn't be enslaved. And now there's laws against, they overturned it. So it used to be that way. It used to be we're not going to enslave other Christians, very similar to the Muslim understanding that we're not going to enslave other Muslims, right? But in both cases, with Christianity and Islam, people find ways around it. So Maryland passed laws that baptism did not affect the enslaved person's status, and white women could not marry African American men. So you have all these laws going around. You do have resistance happening, though. African families were split up as father, mother, and children were sold separately. Those who adopted Christianity still implemented African culture in their worship. So we have a lot of syncretism happening where you have Christian ideas and then African culture, and they don't want to give up that culture. They kind of blend them together, right? And in this, we see things like songs and storytelling happening in within African traditional customs. Many slaves would break tools, go on hunger strikes, refuse to work, or fleeing, even if they knew they would likely be caught and punished severely. So, anyway, so not a great situation that we're gearing up for on the labor front. And there's much more to go over. So go ahead and write that summary, and I look forward to discussing this with you when we return.